The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot, Chapter 16, Spending Eternity in the Same Place. During my first visit with Henrietta's cousin, Cootie, as we sat drinking juice, he told me that no one ever talked about Henrietta. Not when she was sick, not after she died, and not now. We didn't say words like cancer, he told me, and we don't tell stories on dead folks. At that point, he said, the family had gone so long without talking about Henrietta, it was almost like she'd never existed, except for her children and those cells. It sounds strange, he said, but her cells done live longer than her memory. If I wanted to know anything about Henrietta, he told me, I'd need to go up the road and talk to her cousin Cliff, who'd grown up with her like a brother. When I pulled into Cliff's driveway, he figured I was a Jehovah's Witness or an insurance sales rep, since the only white people who visited him were usually one or the other. He smiled and waved just the same, saying, "How you doing?" Cliff was in his 70s and still minding the tobacco barn behind the farmhouse his father had built decades earlier, checking the furnaces several times a day to make sure they stayed at 120 degrees. Inside Cliff's house, the electric blue and white walls were darkened with smudges of oil and dirt. He'd blocked the stairs to the second floor with cardboard and blankets to keep warm air from going up and out through missing windows. And he'd patched holes in his ceiling, walls, and windows with newspaper and duct tape. He slept downstairs on a thin, sheetless twin bed across from the refrigerator and wood stove, next to a folding table where he'd piled so many pills. He'd forgotten what they were all for. Maybe the prostate cancer, he said. Maybe the pressure. Cliff spent most of his time on his porch, sitting in a plaid recliner so worn down it was mostly just exposed foam and springs, waving at each car that passed. He was about 6 feet tall, even with several inches of slouch, his light brown skin dry and weathered like alligator, his eyes sea green at the center, with deep blue edges. Decades in shipyards and tobacco fields had left his hands coarse as burlap. His fingernails yellowed, cracked, and worn to the cuticles. As Cliff talked, he stared at the ground and twisted his arthritic fingers, one over the other, like he was crossing them all for good luck. Then he untwisted them and started again. When he heard I was writing a book about Henrietta, he got up from his recliner, pulled on a jacket, and walked over to my car, yelling, "Come on then, I'll show you where she's buried." About a half-mile down Laxtown Road, Cliff had me park in front of a cinder block and pressboard house that couldn't have been more than 300 square feet inside. He jerked open a log and barbed-wired gate that led into a pasture and motioned for me to walk through. At the end of the pasture, hidden in the trees, stood a slave-time log cabin covered in boards with gaps wide enough to see through. Its windows had no glass and were covered by thin pieces of wood and rusted Coke signs from the 50s. The house slanted, its corners resting on piles of rocks of varying sizes that had been holding it above ground for more than 200 years, its base high enough off the ground for a small child to crawl under. "That there's the old home house where Henrietta grew up," Cliff yelled, pointing. We walked toward it through red dirt and dried leaves that cracked under our feet, the air smelling of wild roses, pine, and cows. "Henrietta kept it nice, a real home house. Now I can't hardly recognize it." The floors inside were covered with straw and manure. They'd collapsed in several places under the weight of cows that now roamed free on the property. Upstairs, in the room Henrietta once shared with Day, a few remnants of life lay scattered on the floor. A tattered work boot with metal eyes but no laces. a true-age soda bottle with a white and red label, a tiny woman's dress shoe with open toes. I wondered if it was Henrietta's. "Could be," Cliff said. "Sure look like her shoe." He pointed toward what used to be the back wall, which had fallen years earlier, leaving little more than the frames of 2 tall windows. "This is where Henrietta slept." She used to lie on her stomach and stare out those windows, looking at the woods and the family cemetery, a small 1/4-acre clearing where a few strands of barbed wire now surrounded a scattering of tombstones. The same cows that had trampled the home house floor had destroyed several sections of the cemetery fence. They'd left manure and hoof prints on graves, crushed flower arrangements into piles of stems, ribbon, and styrofoam, and knocked over several tombstones which now lay flat on the ground next to their bases. When he got outside, Cliff shook his head and picked up fragments of a broken sign. One piece said, "We love," the other said, "Mom." Some of the family tombstones were homemade from concrete. A few were store-bought in marble. "Them's the folks with some money," Cliff said, pointing to a marble one. Many graves were marked with index card-sized metal plates on sticks with names and dates. The rest were unmarked. "Used to be we'd mark them graves with a rock so we could find 'em," Cliff told me. "But the cemetery got cleared out one time with a bulldozer, so that pretty much cleared those rocks on away." "There were so many people buried in the Lack Cemetery now," he said. "They'd run out of room decades ago and started piling graves on top of each other." He pointed at an indentation in the ground with no marker beside it. "This was a good friend of mine," he said. Then he started pointing around the graveyard to other body-sized indentations in the dirt. "See that sunken right there, and that sunken right there, and there? Them all's unmarked graves. They sink after a time when the dirt settle around the bodies." Occasionally he'd point to a small plain rock poking through the earth and say it was a cousin or an aunt. "That there's Henrietta's mother," he said, pointing to a lone tombstone near the cemetery's edge, surrounded by trees and wild roses. It was several feet tall, its front worn rough and browned from age and weather. The inscription said this: "Eliza, wife of Junior Pleasant, July 12th, 1888, October 28th, 1924. Gone but not forgotten." Until I read those dates, I hadn't done the math. Henrietta was barely 4 years old when she lost her mother, about the same age Sony was when Henrietta died. Henrietta used to come talk to her mother, took real good care of her grave. Now Henrietta's somewhere in here with her, Cliff said, waving his arms toward the clearing between Eliza's stone and the next tree a good 15 feet away. "Never did get a marker, so I couldn't tell you exactly where she at, but the immediate family be buried next to each other, so she probably round in here somewhere." He pointed to 3 body-sized indentations in the clearing and said, "Any of those could be Henrietta." We stood in silence as Cliff kicked at the dirt with "I don't know what happened on that deal with them cells from Henrietta," he said eventually. "Don't nobody say anything about it round here. I just knowed she had something rare, 'cause she'd been dead a pretty good while, but her cell's still living, and that's amazing." He kicked at the ground. "I heard they did a lot of research, and some of her cells have developed a lot of curing other diseases. It's a miracle, that's all I can say." Then suddenly he yelled at the ground as if he were talking directly to Henrietta. "They named them HeLa, and they still livin'." He kicked at the dirt again. A few minutes later, seemingly out of nowhere, he pointed to the dirt and said, "You know, white folks and black folks, all buried over top of each other in here. I guess old white granddaddy and his brothers were buried here, too. Really no tellin' who is in this ground now." Only thing he knew for sure, he said. was that there was something beautiful about the idea of slave-owning white laxes being buried under their black kin. "They spend an eternity in the same place," he told me, laughing. "They must have worked out their problems by now." Henrietta's great-grandmother was a slave named Mourning. A white man named John Smith Pleasants inherited Mourning and her husband, George, from his father, one of the first slaveholders in Clover. Pleasants' father came from a family of Quakers, and one of his distant relatives had been the first to fight successfully to free his own slaves through the Virginia courts, but Pleasants hadn't carried on the family's anti-slavery tradition. Mourning and George were enslaved on a tobacco plantation in Clover. Their son, Henrietta's paternal great-grandfather, Edmund, took his owner's last name, which lost the S to become Pleasant. He was eventually freed from slavery at the age of 40, only to be committed later to an asylum for dementia. But before he was freed, he fathered many children, all of them born into slavery, including a daughter named Henrietta Pleasant, the great-aunt of Henrietta Lacks. On the other side of Henrietta's family, her maternal great-grandfather was a white man named Albert Lacks, who'd inherited part of the Lacks plantation in 1885, when his father divided his land among his 3 white sons, Winston, Benjamin, and Albert. Winston Lacks was a burly man with a beard that grew to his belly. He drank almost every night in a saloon hidden in the basement beneath the general store. When Winston got drunk and started fighting, the locals knew it was time for the soberest man to ride and get Fanny. There are no records of Fanny's life, but she was most likely born a slave on the Lacks property. And like most Lacks slaves, who stayed on the plantation as sharecroppers, she never left. She often rode beside Winston in his wagon, and when he got drunk, she'd march into the saloon, snatch him off the bar stool by his long beard, and drag him home. The other brothers, Albert and Benjamin, led more private lives and left behind little history aside from their wills and land deeds. Most of the black Laxes I talked to over the years referred to Benjamin Lacks as Old White Granddaddy, though some still called him Massa Ben, as their parents had. When Benjamin died on February 26, 1889, slavery had been abolished, but few black people owned land of their own. Albert's will left land to 5 colored heirs, most of it in 10-acre chunks, and one of those heirs was Henrietta and Day's grandfather, Tommy Lacks. Albert's will said nothing of his relation to his heirs, but folks in Lackstown knew they were children he'd had with a former slave named Maria. After Albert's death, his brother Benjamin sued to take some of that land away from Albert's black heirs, saying that since it was his father's land originally, he had the right to choose whichever plot he wanted. The court agreed and divided the original Lacks plantation into 2 plots of equal value. The lower section on the river went to Benjamin Lacks. The upper plot, now known as Lackstown, went to the black Laxes. 16 years after the court case, when Benjamin Lacks dictated his own will days before his death, he gave small plots of land to each of his sisters, then divided the remaining 124 acres and his horses between 7 colored heirs of his own, including his nephew Tommy Lacks. There's no record of Benjamin or Albert Lacks marrying or having any white children. There's no record that the black children in Benjamin's will were his own. But he called them his children, and according to Black Lacks oral history, everyone living on the land in Clover that was once the Lacks plantation descended from those 2 white brothers and their black mistresses who were once slaves. When I arrived in Clover, race was still ever present. Roseland was the nice colored fellow who ran Rosie's before it shut down. Bobcat was the white man who ran the mini-mart. Henrietta went to St. Matthew's, the colored church. One of the first things Cootie said when I met him was, "You don't act strange around me, 'cause I'm black. You're not from around here." Everyone I talked to swore race relations were never bad in Clover. But they also said Lackstown was only about 12 miles from the local lynch tree, and that the Ku Klux Klan held meetings on a school baseball field less than 10 miles from Clover's main street until well into the 1980s. Standing in the cemetery, Cliff told me, "The white laxes know their kin all buried in here with ours, 'cause they family. They know it. But they'll never admit it. They just say, them black laxes, they ain't kin." When I went to visit Carlton and Ruby Lax, the oldest white laxes in Clover, they smiled and chit-chatted as they led me from their front door into a living room filled with pastel blue overstuffed chairs and Confederate flags, one in each ashtray, several on the coffee table, and a full-size one on a stand in the corner. Carlton and Ruby were distant cousins before they became husband and wife. They were both related to Robin Lax, the father of Albert and Ben, and Winston Lax, which meant they were also Henrietta and Day's distant cousins. Carlton and Ruby had been married for decades, and had more children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren than they could count. All they knew for sure was that there were more than 100 of them. Carlton was a frail man in his late 80s, with skin so pale it almost looked translucent. Tufts of his hair, like overgrown cotton, spouted from his head, brows, ears, and nostrils as he sat in his easy chair, mumbling about his years working the bank at the tobacco warehouse. "I wrote out those checks," he said, mostly to himself. "I was the tobacco king." Ruby was in her late 80s too, with a sharp mind that seemed decades younger than her frail body. She talked right over Carlton, telling me about the relatives who had farmed the Lax plantation, and their relation to Ben and Albert Lax. When I mentioned that Henrietta came from Laxtown, Ruby straightened in her chair. "Well, that was colored," she snapped. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You're not talking about coloreds, are you?" I told her I wanted to learn about both the white and black Laxes. "Well, we never did know each other," she said. "The white and the blacks didn't mix then, not like they do now. Which I can't say I like, because I don't think it's for the best." She paused and shook her head. "Mixing them like that, during school and church and everything, they end up white and black get together and marry and all, I just can't see the sense in it." When I asked how she and Carlton were related to the black Laxes, they looked at each other from across the coffee table like I'd asked them if they were born on Mars. "My daddy's uncle kept a lot of colored Laxes as slaves," Ruby said. "That must be the way they got their name. Evidently, they took it when they left the plantation. That's the only thing I can figure." Later, I asked Henrietta's sister, Gladys, what she thought of their theory. Though she'd lived about a mile from Carlton and Ruby Lax most of her 90 years, Gladys said she'd never heard of them. "Black and white Lax is kin," Gladys said, "but we don't mix." She pointed under the couch where I was sitting. "Get Gillian's letter," she said to her son Gary. As far as Gladys knew, all of Henrietta's other siblings were dead, except maybe Lillian, the youngest. The last anyone had heard from Lillian was a letter she'd sent someone in the 80s, which Gladys kept in a shoebox under the couch. In it, Lillian wrote, "I heard Daddy died in a fire," and she asked if it was true. It was. He died in 1969, 2 decades before she sent that letter. But what Lillian really wanted to know was who'd been talking to people about her life. She'd won the lottery, she said, and she believed someone was trying to kill her because white folks had been coming around asking questions about her life in Clover and her family, especially Henrietta. "They knew things I didn't even know," she wrote. "I don't think anybody should talk about other people. No one in the family had heard from her since." Lillian converted to Puerto Rican, Gladys said, holding the letter to her chest. I looked at Gary, who sat beside her. Lillian's skin was real light, even lighter than Mom's. Gary explained, "She married a Puerto Rican somewhere in New York. Since she could pass, she disowned her blackness, converted to Puerto Rican, because she didn't want to be black no more."